everyone. My name is Stephen Thomas. I'm with the National Medal of Honor Heritage Center, which is located in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I am originally from Murfreesboro, however. I was bred and buttered here, if you don't mind me saying. I grew up knowing a lot of veterans in the community. My great uncle himself was a Vietnam veteran. My mother worked at the VA for 36 years. And that was actually the first time that I became familiar with this thing called the Medal of Honor. Because the VA Medical Center here in Murfreesboro is actually named after a Medal of Honor recipient. Does anybody know who that is?
Alvin York.
Alvin C. York, yes. So he is one of 33 Tennesseans that have received the Medal of Honor since its inception in 1861. But before I go any further, do you happen to know what the Medal of Honor is? What is it?
It's the highest ranking medal you can get.
It is the highest award for military valor for our country. That is correct. Only just over 3,500 men and one woman have received this medal for valor in actions both during the Civil War all the way up to the modern day War on Terror. Okay? Now, why Chattanooga? Right? I get this question all the time. Why is such a massive facility with interactive and immersive exhibits located in Chattanooga, Tennessee? Well, Chattanooga is considered the birthplace of the Medal of Honor because within a 25-mile radius of our downtown location, the first 52 actions took place that warranted the Medal of Honor during the Civil War. Okay? The battles of Chattanooga include the Battle of Waxahachie, Missionary Ridge, Chickamauga, and Lookout Mountain, more commonly referred to as the Battle Above the Clouds. Okay? Now, we also interpret the very first medals that were awarded for Andrews Raiders. Now, Andrews Raid is a pretty well-known story. In fact, Disney even wrote or filmed a movie in the 60s with Fez Parker called The Great Locomotive Chase. If you're looking at that movie as historically accurate, do not. It is far from it. Let me turn that off because I don't need to compete with our own theme music. I do that enough. Now, the very first Medal of Honor recipient is Jacob Parrott. Okay? Jacob Parrott was 18 years old when he volunteered for a secret mission that was being led by a civilian smuggler named James Andrews. Now, James devised this plan with General Mitchell just outside of Murfreesboro, in fact, in between Murfreesboro and Shelbyville. Okay? Now, the plan was that they were going to infiltrate behind Confederate lines, they were going to commandeer a train, and they were going to drive it back up to Chattanooga. And the reason for that is that they were going to cause as much havoc as they could along the way. Burning bridges, tearing up railroad track, cutting telegraph wire. Why do you think they were trying to do that? Sabotage, right? See, Chattanooga is a very important junction in railroad, right? So you've got the Memphis to Chattanooga rail line, and you have the Chattanooga-Atlanta rail line. Those are the most important rail lines for the South. That is how they're going to get supplies and troop movement done. So if you can stop at least one of them, you can almost guarantee that the war for the Confederates will come to a halt. Okay? So Jacob Parrott was stationed right outside of Shelbyville with his Ohio Infantry Regiment when he was approached by some NCOs that were also volunteering for the mission and asked him if he was interested. He was, and just like any other 18-year-old kid, they're looking for an adventure, right? We don't know a whole lot about Jacob's background as a kid. We don't know a lot about his upbringing. He was very, very quiet about his upbringing, in fact. Now, they will devise, the plan as it was devised is they were going to break apart in groups of 2 and 3, and they were going to start making their way down to a place called Big Shanty. Now it is known as Marietta. Okay? Marietta, they were going to commandeer a train. However, some of the men weren't able to make it there. In fact, 2 men were captured by the Confederates, and they end up fighting with the Confederates for a little while until they get to the Union lines, and then they defect back across. Okay? There were 2 other men that overslept the night before the raid, and they didn't get to make it in time. So now, out of 24, we have 21 men, including James Andrews. 20 men, including James Andrews. So only 19 of these men are military service members, okay? There is James Andrews and then William Campbell. William Campbell was going to be the engineer for the train, okay? So they get down to Big Shanty. They commandeer a train named the General, and they start driving it back to Chattanooga. Now, unfortunately, for about 4 days leading up to the event, it had been pouring rain all over Georgia, which means that they are going to have a hard time driving their train. Why? Not the tracks. You got a guess? Anybody else know? The train is a steam engine. What do you need for steam? Dry timber and water, right? You need both of those things to create the steam to drive the engine. Now, by the time they get to Ringgold, Georgia, okay, they've already made it, they're almost into Chattanooga. Their dry tinder ran out. So they actually had to abandon the train, and they had to escape, and they all scattered. However, within a couple of days, all 20 men were going to be captured, okay? Now, James Andrews is going to be made an example of. He is actually executed immediately as a spy and as a traitor, and the reason he was executed as a traitor is because he had been telling the Confederate officers that he was smuggling with and doing trading, like on the black market kind of thing, that he was from Mississippi, when in reality he was from Ohio, okay? Now, they execute him right outside of Atlanta. The other 19 men are going to be held for about a week and a half. They are put on trial. 7 men are charged with treason, and they are executed. Now, all the while, the remainder of the men, there are 6 men in particular, Jacob Parrott being one of them, witnessed it all, and they were terrified. They were scared for their lives. And in fact, William Pittenger, who was one of those 6, he was the most educated of all the raiders. He could actually read and write. He penned 2 letters to Jefferson Davis begging for their release, okay? Now, this is not something we normally hear about Medal of Honor recipients, right? We often think about Medal of Honor recipients as what? Heroes, right? But what happens when you see them on that pedestal all the time? You get surprised that they were captured, or you're surprised that they were killed in action, right? You're surprised that they are, whatever. You got to start looking at them as a human being first, because then it makes the heroic seem even more grand. Okay? So if you can relate to an individual on a human level, then you can start to see yourself. I'm like, oh, okay, well, I have some of those values, right? Now, for Parrott, he is the youngest of all of the raiders that were captured. At this point, he's about to turn 19, and he was actually lashed over 100 times. Do you know what lashing is? Whipped. He was whipped over 100 times. By the Confederates while he was imprisoned, okay? Now, because the United States Army, as we know them as the Union Army, right, they were moving so much that the POWs had to be transferred. They had to be moved around a bunch, which means their paperwork is not keeping up with them. And in fact, enough time had passed that people started to forget who they were. And in fact, Jefferson Davis probably never read those 2 letters, but they were exchanged for prisoners, right? To exchange for Confederate prisoners. So they, after their release, are immediately called to Washington. They are sent to Secretary of War Edward Stanton's office, where he is going to bestow the first 6 medals of honor to these men, but Jacob Parrott being the first because he was the youngest and because he was targeted. He had gone through more than a lot of the other men had because of that whipping, right? Now, after the event, right, you would think that it would be, an easy transition for all of them. But in fact, all of them had told Davis in those letters that they wouldn't take up arms against the Confederacy again for the rest of their lives if they had been exchanged for prisoners. However, every single one of them stayed in the Army and in fact took the fight back to the Confederates. It's pretty interesting, right? So those are the first medals, but they keep going, right? You know, we have, our mission is to continue to tell the stories, to memorialize their history, right? Because if we don't honor those men and that one woman, we will forget them, right? And we don't want to do that, okay? But there are 6 character values that are associated with the Medal of Honor: patriotism, citizenship, courage, integrity, sacrifice, and commitment. Now, what I find most interesting about all of these values is that we all have them, right? But oftentimes these don't show up until things get difficult, right? That's typically when you have to exert your values into your life and actually have a physical manifestation of what that is, right? But you know what's really, really cool? There is a single thread going through every single one of those. Can anybody take a guess as to what that might be? Service, right? It all boils back down to service. But even at service, there's something you can boil it down to even further. Love. It's a love for something and a recognition that something is bigger than us, right? Those are American values, right? You know, Lincoln talked a lot about a more perfect union, right? How do we do that? Well, that is how you do it. Service through love. It's not service through coercion or anything like that, right? It's you've got to want to serve deep down in your heart, okay? And these 3,500 plus men and women do that. You can read their citations, but the issue with the citation is you're reading about the worst day of their lives, right? You don't know what led up to that or what happened after. Alvin York is a great example. Now, Alvin, after the war is over, he turned his efforts towards education. If you've ever heard of the York Institute, it's a pretty well-known school. It's still standing to this day-ish in operation. But throughout the 1930s, he actually had to go and fundraise himself to get schools built. And the reason he wanted to do that is because when he went into World War I, when he was drafted at the age of 35 years old. And he had a 3rd grade education, okay? Now, when he was drafted, he was actually claiming conscientious objector status because he had a really tumultuous childhood that was very violent. He became a pacifist throughout his 20s. Now, once he hit the war and he had to go to training, his instructors, as he's going through his basic training, are trying to convince him that the Germans are actually trying to destroy all of Europe and all of the culture of Europe. And we are actually doing it with God on our side. That was the only way that he was going to be convinced that he could go to war and actually kill Germans. Okay? So throughout the 30s, as he's fundraising, he's actually running into some issues. He's running into people that don't want him to fundraise, don't want him to build schools. And in fact, there was one group that was gaining a lot of popularity at that time known as the America First Party. They were trying to tout themselves as a political party. They were getting a lot of their financial backing from Henry Ford. If you know anything about Henry Ford, very big anti-Semitic views. He aligned himself with another Medal of Honor recipient, Charles Lindbergh, who was the spokesperson for the group, for the party. Now, Lindbergh, even though he was a Medal of Honor recipient with the America First group, would fly to Germany on occasion. And in fact, on one of his flights over, he actually received an award from Hermann Goering, the Field Marshal General for the Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force at the time. Now, if you don't fully understand, right, Dr. Seuss actually has a great cartoon to depict, to help you understand what this party is all about. There is an old man standing in Europe. There's an old man standing in the United States. They are sharing a beard across the Atlantic Ocean, and written across it in the beard says fascism, right? So how does something like that happen? Well, it's going to be cloaked in the flag. Anytime a nationalistic point of view is going to come around here in the United States, it will more than likely be holding and flying an American flag. So it's done so you can actually, you lose perspective, okay? But York never did. He would actually go and listen to Lindbergh's speeches and in fact would write editorials about it, saying that if our children hear this man speak, we will have war on our doorstep in no time, right? And he wasn't wrong, right? It was right around the corner. But once the United States becomes a little bit more involved in the war effort with Lend-Lease agreements and oil embargoes and all of that, the United States pretty much picks a side. We figured out pretty early on that we were going to be a part of the Allied group because we were supporting both Britain and Russia with arms, okay? York was terrified of us going to war again, right? He could see the writing on the wall. He understood that the war that he fought in was not over. And this is just a continuation of what was left. So when Warner Brothers approached him and asked to buy the rights to his story because they want to make a movie about him, they do so under one stipulation. They are able to make the movie Sergeant York because they actually helped him fundraise to build 6 schools in the state of Tennessee. So in 1941, the movie Sergeant York is actually going to be released. He was still terrified that it was going to be used as propaganda to get young men to join the war effort, right? He didn't want his name to be used when these men are going. And in fact would say, if they don't serve with their heart, they're not going to be good servants, right? I mean, that's pretty common. Now, when it comes to the education efforts of the Medal of Honor Heritage Center, we tend to focus our efforts on, telling the whole story about the individual, right? Because if you want a memorial, cemeteries are a memorial, right? You go to battlefields, those are memorials. But a cultural education center, we get to delve deep into the histories of all of these individuals. And you can see some of the exhibits here. And that right there is George Jordan. He's Tennessee's only known black recipient. He was originally enslaved in Williamson County, we believe just south of Franklin, near Thompson Station. But we don't know what property he lived at. Because in 1860, when that was considered the height of American chattel slavery, there's no name listed for him. We have no idea. He was just a young man at that time. But he first shows up on record in 1866 when he's joining the United States Colored Troops in Nashville. The USCT had fought tooth and nail throughout the Civil War and actually had some great battles. The 13th and 14th USCT up in Nashville, man, you want to read some harrowing stories. Those are by far some of the best Civil War stories you can read about soldiers actually fighting, and especially black soldiers fighting another army that, they know that if they're captured, there's no telling what's going to happen to them, right? Now, for Jordan, he becomes part of the Buffalo Soldiers. So when the Army was getting ready to send the 9th and 10th U.S. Cav out west to fight indigenous tribes, they said, you're going to a desert. You don't need cold weather clothing. It gets hot in a desert. But if you've ever been in a desert at night, it gets very, very cold. So what these men start doing is they start hunting buffalo, and they start making their own cold weather clothing. They make hats. That's where the hair of buffalo kind of comes from. There's one example of an overcoat that's in the Smithsonian in DC. It looks very heavy, and I tried to convince them that I should hold it because I wanted to see how heavy it was, but they didn't like that idea. I couldn't imagine why. But for Jordan, his action or his citation is actually made up of 2 separate actions. He was leading a detachment of 25 men and protecting settlers as they were moving to their new settlement. They were ambushed by over 100 Apache warriors. But he was so good under pressure that he was actually able to defend the settlers out in the middle of an open field, basically, and not suffer any casualties, but inflicted mass casualties onto the Apache, right? Very, very cool. That in itself is a Medal of Honor worthy action. But because he is a black soldier, oftentimes they had to go even further. And that's why I said his citation is made up of two actions. The second one, he actually led a charge to close off a flank. As the Apaches were, the 9th U.S. Cav thought they were launching an ambush, when in fact the Apaches knew they were there and they were trying to skirt them to get around behind them. So he saw that and he volunteered to lead the charge. He closed off the flank and the Apaches were wiped out at that point. So he will receive his Medal of Honor around 1895. And then by the time 1900 rolls around, he's retired. He settled with his wife at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, where a lot of former Buffalo soldiers would end up. A lot of those men stayed out west. Now, his wife, unfortunately, is going to pass away in 1901. Cause of death is unknown. But he develops a kidney disease around 1903, and he goes to Fort Robinson to seek medical treatment. He had been known there. They've hosted parades in his name and his honor. They've hosted dinners, celebrations for him, but he was denied access to the medical treatment. Why? Because he was black. That was the whole reason. And in fact, he was turned away and he went home, and 2 weeks later he died. Now, I don't think that any kind of medical assistance they could have given him would have saved his life, because from my estimation, it sounds like he would have needed dialysis at that point. But after his passing, the chaplain at Fort Robinson had heard about what happened. And so he started a petition, and he got 5,000 signatures on it and sent it to DC. And now, because of his story, any military service member can go to any military base in the world, United States military base, and receive medical care regardless of race, creed, sexual orientation, any of that, right? It all stems back to a Tennessean, right? Now, in World War I, there were 6 Tennesseans to receive the Medal of Honor. We know about Alvin York, right? The other 5, I'm going to talk about this gentleman. That is Joseph Atkinson. Atkinson is going to represent the other 5 Tennesseans, or the remaining Tennesseans that received the medal, because all of them charged a German machine gun emplacement, and that's how they received their medal, right? So he is actually stationed with the British, or at the British sector of the Hindenburg Line, and that portion of the trenches were so heavily defended by the Germans that the British had to develop a technique, and the way they would get around those defenses is they would do boxed artillery. So what they do is their bombardments would hit coordinates in a box, and they would put their soldiers in the box, and they would just walk across no man's land, because as the bombardment's happening, the Germans are keeping their heads down. Unfortunately, this bombardment led up about 50 yards too short. So now he and his men are just stuck out in no man's land, and he's getting shot at for about 5 minutes. And in fact, in his citation, it says, after 5 minutes of being shot at, Atkinson jumps up and charges the machine gun nest. Now, the eyewitnesses that saw this said it looked as though he was hovering in the air, running in the air. They said it looked like he didn't have any obstacles in his way. Well, if you look at photographs of the Hindenburg Line at that time, there are sections of barbed wire that are 5 yards thick in places. So my estimation is that man was running on top of barbed wire. Think about that for a sec. He gets to the trench. He kicks the gun off the parapet and into the trench. And then he takes the German machine gun crew prisoner. Now, he's 50 yards away from any ally. He's got trench corners everywhere where the Germans can come around the corner at any point, and he's done for. But he took those men prisoner. That is what's wild to think about. Now, at the exact same time he's performing his action, about 500 yards north of the trench that he was at, there is another Tennessean performing the same exact action on 5 separate occasions to knock out 5 German machine guns. First Sergeant Milo Limmert, he will not survive the day. He was mortally wounded after taking that 5th machine gun, but he knocked it out, right? That war is pretty nasty. Once you guys get a little bit closer to that war and studying it, you are going to realize that it was a nasty war, and no wonder it was going to continue because nothing was ever really solved from that conflict. Now, a lot of the work that we do is with volunteers, right? Our volunteer corps is made up mostly of veterans because they understand that if we don't continue to tell the stories, then that history could be lost, right? Now, we get to do so many different things with our volunteers. This is one of our volunteer board members. She is also the Hamilton County and Chattanooga historian, Linda Moss Mines. She wrote a book called Making of a Hero. If you get a chance to ever make it down to Chattanooga, please come pick up a copy at our gift shop because it is a great book for younger children to help them understand the Medal of Honor and the values that are associated with it, okay? We do a lot of educational outreach and programming. We host events all the time, right? The one that we just finished with is our series, or most recent installment in the series, Wine and War. So what we do is we go to these different locations where the United States military has influenced or has been in conflict, and we find the wine and cuisine from that area. Specifically, the first one was Korea. And so we brought in Korean wine and Korean cuisine, and we actually hosted a dinner within the gallery. You'll see a really cool picture of he was the last surviving Korean War Medal of Honor recipient, Ralph Puckett. But Mr. Puckett actually passed away about a week and a half ago. So there are no more Korean War Medal of Honor recipients. So these guys, I've seen the last 2 World War II Medal of Honor recipients pass away. I've been at both of their funerals. And Mr. Puckett passing away, marking the last Korean War recipient, it can be pretty devastating sometimes. In fact, we just recently, back in February, or end of January, excuse me, we lost the most recent Medal of Honor recipient, Captain Larry Taylor. He was a Cobra helicopter pilot during Vietnam. He was only in Vietnam. He only did 1 tour of duty for 11 months. And within 11 months, he racked up 58 combat awards. 58. And in fact, the action that he performed to receive the Medal of Honor was only upgraded last year. It was originally a Silver Star, but even before that, he was originally going to be court-martialed. So he was one of the first pilots to have a Cobra helicopter. In 1968, there were only 9 available in country. And an attack helicopter is only about 36 inches wide. The whole aircraft is about there, right? Now, as he was coming back from a night mission, he got a call over the radio that there was a team of LRPs. LRP is an acronym that stands for Long Range Reconnaissance Patrolmen. So these guys are the guys that you take way out into the jungle, you drop them off, and then they have to be able to see and listen and take note of everything. They need to be able to find out if this is a place where they can launch an attack, where there's supply depots, all of those kinds of things, right? Well, these 4 men of Team Wildcat 2, they got surrounded by 200 North Vietnamese regulars. Now, they were they were very close to being annihilated. If it weren't for Larry hearing their call for Mayday over the radio and call for help, they would have been killed. So Larry calls back to his fire base because he can't pick up these men. He doesn't have any room in his helicopter. It's only made for 2 people, pilot and co-pilot. Now, when he calls back, he's looking to get a Huey sent up, which is a transport helicopter. Unfortunately, his commanding officer denied it, and in fact ordered him to come back to base immediately because he did not want that helicopter that he was in to be damaged or captured by the enemy. So what did Larry Taylor do? He turned off his radio. Boop. He got back on the radio with Wildcat 2 and he started devising a plan. So for the next 40 minutes, he is emptying all of his machine gun ammo and all of his rockets into the NVA. Now, while he was doing that, he was instructing the LRPs to set their Claymore mines in a certain pattern because Larry, from his elevation, could see where all the muzzle flashes from the NVA were. And so he knew that if he put them in certain locations, it could do the most damage. So the LRPs do that. And as they are doing that, after they set them, he tells them to fall back to the river that's about 50 yards behind them. So they get to the river. Larry brings his helicopter down to the bank of the river, and he's just setting one skid on the riverbank at a time. So when he does that, two men jump up onto the helicopter and they're riding the rocket pods. They're riding them, right? Like this, backwards, right? He turns the helicopter to get the other two guys on. They just grab onto the skids. They're just hanging onto the skids. Now at this point, he jumps up to 1,500 feet and he takes off, right? He gets about 20 miles away from where that action was taking place, and he found a water treatment plant that was abandoned. He set down his helicopter. The four men got off. They walked in front, and Larry even said there was enough light from the panels that were reflecting outward that he saw all four men stand in front of the helicopter, saluted him, went off into the dark. They didn't see each other again until 1985. Now, when Larry got back to the base, his commanding officer was filling out the paperwork for his court-martial. And he even famously said to him, "What, you want me to take him back?" So once that document or the court-martial paperwork was starting to make its way up to the chain, it gets to the commanding general, who is a two-star general, a World War II veteran, and also a Medal of Honor recipient with the Big Red 1, the 1st Infantry Division. Now, when he got that paperwork, he called the commanding officer in and he said, "I'm not going to court-martial him, I'm going to give him a medal." And so he gave him he got his citation for a Silver Star. Then it was forgotten about. However, the story stayed within the lore of Army aviation. And in fact, my best friend, Jonathan Henderson, who lives here in Murfreesboro still, is a Army aviation crew chief on a Black Hawk, or a retired crew chief. He remembered hearing the story in his training back in 2012-13, right? Now, 1985, there was a reunion for the Big Red 1. Now, these four men that all survived the combat, or excuse me, there were three men. One man did not survive the war. Three men had gone to the reunion and brought their entire family. They brought their children, their grandchildren, and they are all in a room. And Larry even said it was about 200 people in this one room, right? And they pulled everybody into a corner that were a part of this family, and it was about 80 people. And they stopped them and said, "You see these people? If it weren't for you, they would not exist." Right? That is when they found out, Wildcat 2, the team of LRPs, they found out that he didn't receive the Medal of Honor. They always assumed that he had received it for that action. When they found that out, they were mad. And they started devising the plan, gathering all the documentation, all that was necessary. Fast forward to 2015. Two of the team of Wildcat 2 had passed away from cancer, from exposure to Agent Orange. And there's only one member of the team left, and his name is Dave Hill. Sergeant Dave Hill I love Dave. He's awesome to drink a beer with because he's got crazy stories. But he's such a genuine human being when he's talking about Larry. Because when it finally came time to get his citation approved by Congress, Dave went to DC. He stood on the floor with his representative and said, "If you don't do this, This man is going to die because at this point, Larry had been fighting cancer for almost a decade. And he had beaten it every single time, but he kept fighting it, right? Now, we get all the way up to 2019. I get hired with the National Medal of Honor Heritage Center. I get brought in, and at the same day, my very first day, same time, Larry was coming in for an interview because they had to do it one more time. But this time they had a 4-star general, a retired 4-star general, to back it all the way up, right? So finally, 2020, it got put on Trump's desk. President Trump had it on his desk for his entire presidency. Or not his entire, for the last year of his presidency. Now, once President Biden moves in, it has to be reasserted through Congress. It's a whole red tape thing. But it gets back to the president's desk and he authorizes it. So in 2023, Larry Taylor will be called to DC. I got to go and witness the ceremony too. It was a very, very cool thing to watch because this man had gone through 50 plus years without very much recognition of his service, to all of a sudden he is known by most. Anybody that is familiar with the military community. He's a Chattanooga native. He lived on Signal Mountain, and he was a jack of all trades. Unfortunately, he will lose his battle to cancer in this past January. So he is actually buried in the Chattanooga National Cemetery. So if you guys ever get a chance to go, it's one of the oldest national cemeteries in the country. It was established even before the Civil War was all the way over. The only one that's ahead of it, can anybody guess which one is the oldest? It's probably the most famous too, Arlington. Arlington is the oldest, and do you know why they chose Arlington? Why?
Because it was the estate of Robert E. Lee.
Why do you think they chose that space?
Just kind of an insult.
Well, it's kind of like, look at what you did. Look at what you could have prevented had you tried to calm things down. Use your status to calm it down. Now, all of our Medal of Honor recipients that we focus on in the center are not necessarily from the state of Tennessee. Have you guys ever heard of Desmond Doss? So the hero without a gun, right? He's a conscientious objector during World War II. He volunteered for service, but he did not want to carry a weapon. He was a Seventh-day Adventist. He was a pacifist. He did not want to kill anybody. So what did he want to do? Sir, since you were familiar, what did he volunteer to do? He became a combat medic. His idea is, I don't want to kill anybody. I want to save as many people as I can. So fast forward to Okinawa, 1945. If you've ever seen the movie Hacksaw Ridge, it was released, I think, in 2006. Maybe, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it depicts him actually performing his action. Now, in his citation, which is actually the longest from World War II, it says that he lowered approximately 75 men. Anybody in here served in the military? What branch? Army. Does the Army deal in approximates? No. Unless it's grenades or artillery even, right? But even artillery now is getting to the point where it can be pinpointed, right? Exactly, right? So, served, all right. Now, the reason they said approximately 75 is because they took the original number from the morning reports, which listed 122 men killed or wounded in this action as being lowered down to safety off of the ridge. There was only one man up there doing all of that work, and that was Desmond Doss. So when they took the number to Desmond to corroborate the story, he said it couldn't have been more than 50. Now, why would he have said it couldn't have been more than 50? A lot of people attribute it to his humility. However, let me give you some context, right? You've been shot at and shelled for 4 days straight and nights. You're probably operating on very little, if any, sleep. You've probably had zero food, very little water. Do you think he's able to keep count? No. And in fact, he tells us what he was doing up on the ridge. He was saying, please, Lord, let me get one more. Let me get one more until there are none left and I'm the last one down. It's all about that next one. It's not about what you're capable of, it's of what you're willing to do. Okay? So this man that was barely 120 pounds soaking wet was able to lower 120 plus men off of a 30-foot escarpment, 30-foot ridge, hand over hand, just like this, until he was the last one down. Now, there's another really fascinating part of his citation. How many of you have ever heard the phrase above and beyond the call of duty? It's pretty common in this kind of context. When in dealing with Medal of Honor recipients, it's very common language. Desmond's citation is the only one that has that phrase with an extra 3-letter word at the front of it. Far above and beyond the call of duty. So why do you guys think that the Army would have added that 3-letter word?
They were pretty impressed.
Right.
Because it was far beyond.
Well, it goes a little bit deeper than that too. I suspect, as a historian, that this is the first time in all the citations I've read up to Desmond and all the ones I've read after, this is the first time I'm recognizing the military, seeing that the military is recognizing his past as a conscientious objector, being someone that refused to carry a firearm and goes and takes the fight to the Japanese. I mean, that is why I think that they put that 3-letter word in there, which is fascinating. Now, Desmond's not originally from Tennessee. He's originally from Lynchburg, Virginia, but he lived in the Chattanooga area for the last 35 years of his life. And he was an integral part to the veteran community. Now, some of the other veterans from World War II, some of the recipients from World War II, Paul Huff. Sergeant Paul Huff was the first American paratrooper to receive the Medal of Honor for actions in World War II. He actually is has the longest time in service of a Medal of Honor recipient in our gallery. He had the longest career of 32 years, I think it was. After his actions in northern Italy at the southern portion of the Alps, he is brought home to do war bond tour drives. He's doing airborne demonstrations all over the country. After the war is over, he stayed in the Army, but when the Korean War started kicking off, he volunteered for duty. And they said, sorry, we need you here. And in fact, before he became president, Eisenhower approaches Huff and says, hey, we are going to be having a Medal of Honor ceremony for the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier from World War II, and I need a recipient that is of that caliber to bestow the medal. And so if you want, you can actually find it on YouTube. There's a clip. You see then President Eisenhower standing at the podium, and you see Paul Huff behind him with a pillow. And on the pillow is the Medal of Honor. Anybody want to guess who the World War I recipient was for the World War I tomb? Alvin York. Alvin York, I love Alvin York. He's probably the most recognizable Medal of Honor recipient. I would say that he is probably the first that in pop culture actually gets to understand, right? But for Paul Huff, he was really good friends with Alvin. He knew him on a very personal level. And there's tons of photographs of Paul visiting Alvin when he was sick and he was in bed, he couldn't get out. Paul would visit him on a regular basis, all the way up in Pall Mall, Tennessee, from Cleveland, Tennessee, which is a heck of a drive if you ever make that. Paul eventually volunteers to go to Vietnam, but they had some hesitation because at this point he is now the command sergeant major of the 101st Airborne stationed at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. They said, okay, we'll let you go, but there are two stipulations. The first one is you cannot go beyond the wire while you're over there. Stand on your head if you think that he did not go beyond the wire. There's no physical evidence of it, but there are stories from the men that served underneath him that he would go out on patrols with them. And at this point, he's in his 50s, right? You got a 50-year-old man going out on patrol, but he is still keeping up with them. Now, The second stipulation was that when he returned to the States, he had to retire. And so he was a man of his word. After his 11-month tour of duty, he comes home, retires out of the Army, and goes to Cleveland, Tennessee, where he lives out the rest of his life very quietly. But he is also part of the glue that builds the veteran community of Chattanooga. Even to this day, Chattanooga, I hear it all the time from people visiting and from people that have lived there their entire lives. Chattanooga is the most patriotic city in the country. I hear it all the time. Right? And you can see it too, because those values that we were talking about, they're also action words, right? Patriotism is a love and loyalty for your country, but if it stops there, it becomes nationalism. It becomes very dangerous very quickly. But if you're not working to make it better, that more perfect union, if you're not continuously pushing that way, it'll all fall apart, right? So that is what both Huff, Desmond Doss, and Charles Coolidge, for whom our namesake, that's what they believed. Now, Charles Coolidge, he was actually with the division that boasted the record for the amount of time on the front lines during World War II. Over 400 days, this division was in active combat throughout Europe. Starting in North Africa, going to Sicily, Italy, southern France, into Germany. Okay? Now, the reason that Coolidge ends up in a Texas National Guard unit, the 36th Infantry Division, is because the National Guard's trying to push out all the weekend warriors that have been around for 10 years. They need the young men in. And so here comes this 18-year-old boy out of Chattanooga, Tennessee, down to Texas, right? Well, he's gearing up. He goes to North Africa. His first time in combat, his company commander actually asks for a surrender from the unit that they were across from. The German unit refused, but his commanding officer always told his men, if you can get out of a fight by asking for them to go ahead and surrender, do it. So fast forward to October 23rd, 1944, in the Vosges forest of eastern France, right on the border of Switzerland, close to the border of Switzerland. He is sent on a recon mission to this hill because another unit that's a part of his division had become surrounded on a nearby hill. He was tasked with trying to figure out how he can get the Germans' attention to him to alleviate that other unit so they could slip out. He does so. For 4 days. He was dug in tighter than a tick on this hill and just given the Germans what for. Didn't suffer any casualties and even faced down a German tank. So because he had asked that unit, that portion of the German army to surrender before the fighting actually began, the Germans decided we're going to turn it back on it. So the German tank, or a German tank, rolls right up to their position, and the hatch opened up. And when the tank commander came out, he spoke in perfect English because he was originally from Chicago. Think about that. He said, "It's time for you to surrender." And Coolidge, without missing a beat, said he told that German, "Sorry, Mac, you're going to have to come and get me." Darts back into the woods, and that tank fired 5 rounds point blank into their positions. Didn't suffer a single casualty. And in fact, he did such a good job that the other unit had left 2 days prior. He'd stayed there a little too long because they were using the batteries from the radio for the bazooka once the tanks showed up. So there was no communication. So finally, once they started running low on ammo, he was actually able to pull them out, right? Now, most recipients, during World War II, the stipulation for recipients is you can have your ceremony in theater or you can have it in D.C. What I find really fascinating is that all of the World War II recipients that we have in our gallery, there's 5 in total that wanted their ceremony in theater because they wanted to be with the men that they said deserved the medal. Right? Oftentimes, that's the reason why we call them recipients. They receive the medal, they're carriers, but the medal is not theirs. You don't win the Medal of Honor, right? Again, citation is the worst day of this individual's life. And so when I come in contact with recipients, it's always very humbling for me too, because I know what that man went through. I've read the story, I've seen the interviews, I've walked the ground in some cases. of their battlefields. So when I have a recipient like Sal Junta is the first recipient for the War on Terror. When he came to the center back in 2022, he was coming to be a keynote speaker for one of our fundraising events. He comes into the gallery. He's in his nice suit. I had met him the day before and we went and had lunch. And so he kind of got to know me a little bit more. But he walked up to me and he didn't have his medal on, which I thought was kind of odd because I had seen most recipients wearing their medal. But he wasn't wearing his. And he came up to me. He was getting ready to do an interview for TV. And he said, "Stephen, you think I should put my medal on for the interview?" And I'm like, well, I mean, they're going to have a caption of your name and Medal of Honor recipient there. So, I mean, you don't have to. But then right after the interview, he was going to go talk to some JROTC students. And he asked me, should I wear my medal for them? And I was like, well, Sal, I mean, I know your story and the news is going to tell your story. Maybe you should wear the medal because I know that that medal for you represents the 2 men that you lost that day. Because I've read your book. I know that that is what that medal means to you. And he goes, I think you're right. And so he put on his medal. And it wasn't until later that day I was told that it was the first time that he had worn his medal since the ceremony in 2008. First time he had worn the medal since his ceremony. And when I asked him why, he said, it's because I feel like I'm part of the team again. I'm not an individual, I'm part of the team. So the wisdom that we get from recipients is to take these values and apply them to the teamwork in service to the nation itself. You don't have to be in the Army to serve the country. You can do it every day. I do it when I come do presentations. Anytime you are trying to move forward and tell these stories of sacrifice, you start to understand that it's for a purpose. It's something bigger, right? Thank you guys so very, very much for your time and your attention. You guys are wonderful. Thank you.